Thank you for this opportunity to participate. It's the third day, I gather. You must be a little bit knocked out by now. I always think when I'm addressing an audience like that of the famous comment that was made by Krugman, the famous economist, to an audience of Indian postgraduate students that he was teaching. And he said, if you're an economist, you will come back in the next life as a physicist, if you're a good economist. But if you're a bad economist, a wicked economist, you'll come back in the next life as a sociologist. Well, I am a sociologist. And I want to begin with a paradox, a South African paradox. We, it's argued, are the most unequal society in the world. I mean, it's not a distinction that one wants to be particularly proud of, and it's a complex question whether you take the Gini coefficient that measures income, whether you look at wealth, and those are two distinct concepts. We are a highly unequal society, but the puzzle is, in spite of the fact of this deep inequality, there has been no research center specifically dedicated to the study of inequality in our university. Of course, I must qualify that. We've had long-standing studies of poverty going back to the 1930s. And we have an excellent study in what we call the other place, University of Cape Town, at Selju, and they do more recent work in the field of inequality. But there is no specific center for the study of inequality in South Africa. Of course, there has been a lot of interest in the question and concern, particularly since democracy, when we began to think more systematically of this legacy of specifically racialized inequality and began to address it with various policy instruments. But I think there has been a feeling amongst my colleagues and in the broader community that it was time to move beyond studies of poverty, which in some ways is a more straightforward exercise because you identify specific needs, lack of water or sanitation or so on, whereas the study of inequality is more complex. And I think there was a feeling that we needed to go beyond the identification of our massive long-term unemployment and start to think, what are the driving forces? What's driving inequality in South Africa? And to do that, we need to look at the structure of the economy and understand power and how it's distributed. And there was a particular question that confronted us in setting up this new center, which has recently been launched, the Southern Center for Inequality Studies here at Wits. And that is that in spite of quite a lot of significant policy instruments, a very progressive constitution that foregrounds the right to education, the right to clean water, and so on. In spite of this, inequality persists. So the question really, in fact, may be deepened. And as Neo Machetle has argued, I mean, in some ways we've addressed the question of poverty, but we haven't confronted the question of inequality, right, Neva? So I think that's the sort of opening comment I wanted to make. The trigger for establishing our centre at Wits were two events, and this is just a context to it. The first was the visit of Thomas Piketty to Wits in 2015. He came here, and you know he made this extraordinary book on capital of the 21st century that made him something of a celebrity. And the point about Piketty's book, which made him a celebrity, is he challenged the sort of conventional view, the sort of trickle down that market-led growth led the idea that it led to less inequality. He challenged that and argued actually deepened inequality, and that progressive social policies could actually facilitate redistributive policies could facilitate growth. And this made it something of a, of course, on the left we've argued this against the trickle down thing for many years, but in mainstream economics this was quite a breakthrough. What's interesting, and what I wanted to kind of emphasize here, is that he opens his chapter on income, where he talks about the relationship between wages, income, and profits, with none other than the massacre of Marikana. And I think it's important that he does that when, as you know, in 2012, just over a year, 4 years ago, there was the massacre of was it 35 mine workers over a wage dispute, over a question of distribution of income. And what he argues, which I find very interesting in the book, was that if you look at Europe, which of course he's mainly focusing on Europe, which has in some ways begun to address, has over in the 20th century begun to address the question of inequality through the welfare state. He argues that the pressure to do that in Europe to address inequality came from what he calls violent shocks. The First World War, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Great Depression, the Second World War. It was these, not the market, but these violent shocks that forced the elite, the ruling class, to address the question of inequality. That's what he argues, that it was these violent shocks that forced the elite to enter some kind of compromise with working people to begin to address inequality. And of course the outcome of that was, in the post-Second World War, was the welfare state, where you began to address through progressive taxation. I want to come back to that. Taxing working people and using it with a strong fiscus to build a public health system, free education in countries, the Nordic countries in particular. So on the one hand, we had that visit here at Wits in 2015. At the same time, as these things happen sometimes by coincidence, it was the moment of the internal uprising of our students, beginning in February 2015 with Roads Must Fall, and then of course broadening into Fees Must Fall. Now that of course was an internal challenge to inequality and brought the question of inequality right into our classrooms. As you know, there was a mass uprising around the question. So the context for the establishment of our centre were these, on the one hand, a global problem of inequality, which was expressed through the work of Piketty, and an internal challenge to the unsustainable levels of inequality that are the legacy of our past and continue into the present. So that's the context that I wanted to sketch for you at the beginning. What we call our centre is the Southern Centre. And the question I wanted to put on the agenda, firstly then, is why Southern? Why Southern? We're in the age of globalization. It's unquestionable. You may remember that book by Thomas Friedman, New York Times columnist, "The Earth is flat," I think it was called. Do you remember? The world is flat. The world is flat. Of course, he says, it's interesting, halfway through the book, of course, he says that, when I was growing up, I was told, "Thomas, eat your vegetables. The people in China and India are starving." I tell my daughters, "Do your homework, otherwise the Indians and the Chinese will steal your jobs." So, the moment he says that, of course, that the Earth isn't flat. It's highly uneven. Global capitalism is developed historically in a very uneven way. And of course, that's why you have you do have a global labour market for the first time in human history, a global with the collapse of the communist world, opening and drawing in, doubling the size of the global workforce over the last 30 years, by bringing in, of course, largely unprotected workers into the global labour market, and making possible that massive shift of manufacturing industry from the north to the south. So you have transnational, historically, you no longer produce shoes in the United States, but you produce them in those sweatshops of Southeast Asia. Nike, for example. The slogan of Nike is, "Just do it." Right, just do it. And what does Nike do? What does it do? What's its activity? It doesn't make shoes. It makes the concept of the shoe. The shoes are made in sweatshops in Southeast Asia, largely by young Asian women, in so-called export processing zone. What Nike does is the concept. Just do it. And of course, the person who you associate with "just do it" is, what's the name of the man with the slogan "just do it"? Come on, you're becoming economics students.
Richard Branson.
Not Richard Branson. No. Mike, give her a big hand there. That's extraordinary. On the board. Michael Jordan got more money for lending his name to "just do it" than the total wage bill of the woman who produced the shoes. Right? So that's inequality on a global scale. It's a very important thing. But what the question I'm posing here is why then, if it's a global phenomenon, why focus on a southern perspective? Well, the famous English historian E.H. Carr used to say that what you see depends on which side of the mountain you stand. Well, I stand here in southern Africa, the tip of Southern Africa, and you've got to look at, and one of the problems we realized when we started to look at inequality studies is that all the centers in the study of inequality in the north, at Harvard, at Columbia, at LSE, and so on. So our feeling was that and it's really rather technical, dominated by that narrow economics that Gillard and Neil are so concerned to expand in this conference, rethinking economics, very narrow economics, assuming that if you've identified trends across the globe, you've actually understood why inequality is reproduced in the South. No. You've got to understand the specific social and political dynamics that are driving inequality in the South. But before I go any further here, what do you mean by the South? I think it is a geographical concept in part. It's those countries that were colonized under the wave of European imperialism, so we're thinking of parts of South America and Asia and Africa. But the way I'm using it, it's not just a geographical concept, it's a political concept. It's a reference to the growing, to the marginalized and the dispossessed. So you can have, if you like, you could have the South in the North, and you could have the North in the South. In other words, you can have elements of equality or wealth in the North. You could have poverty in the North and the South. I think we're trying to capture a broad political notion. What's distinctive about the South. I want to give you two examples. I want to take the labour market first. If you look at work in, let's take Africa. It's Ghana has got maybe 20% of its workforce in wage labour. The rest is the informal economy. And even those in wage labour may be working in small informal enterprises. And India, 93% in the informal economy. Now, what are the implications? I want to focus on just one example. Let me take care work. Now, we know care work is a very crucial issue. When the North talks about care work, they're talking about looking after children, right? In the South, care work is much broader than that. Care work in the South is about unpaid reproduction of the household. It may involve not just looking after the family, it may involve collecting firewood. It may involve collecting water. Because you're talking about a society that's much less developed in terms of the ability to reproduce itself. In the North, you have a large public sector, and care work would be handled in a country like Sweden, paid decent jobs. We don't have that in the South. There is no welfare state. There are attempts in that direction. In order to build the welfare state, I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, you needed progressive taxation. Well, you can't build a taxation system when you have the workers in an informal economy to build the income tax. So we haven't got the mechanism in the South, I would argue, for the kinds of redistributive mechanisms that were happening. That's a second point I want to make. A reason why one needs a Southern perspective is, in the South, we're still dealing with societies in which there are multiple forms of oppression and identity. Caste in India, ethnicity, particularly kinship and family ties. I'm not saying class is not important, I'll come to that. But that's why the concept of intersectionality is a no-brainer for the South. It's obvious. There's a multiple forms of oppression in the South. I'm not comfortable with identity politics of the North because it's disconnected from class. I think class is a central part of it, but I think when you look at the South, I think you have to see the South through multiple forms of inequality. So I'm just giving two examples of why we need a Southern approach. And I just want to, I'm really a bit of a, okay, I'm sorry about this. How are we going to go about it? Well, there are three pillars to the way in which I think a Southern approach to inequality. The one is that it needs to be interdisciplinary. If you're going to identify the social and political forces, you've got to go beyond neoclassical economics, not only into heterodox economics, you want into other disciplines in the social sciences, firstly. Secondly, you need to understand power. Now, there's two narratives around power in South African inequality studies. There is a sort of capability approach that emphasizes the importance of individual mobility and education. There's another discourse, and I think it's a discourse that's shaping our things, that you need to look at the structure of capital, not just the power, but particularly the power of capital, corporate power, market power, but also how that power is translated, as I've suggested to you, across a range of different sources. Race, gender, sexuality. That's where the intersectionality approach. So power is the second pillar. The third one, it needs to be historical. If you want to understand inequality in the South, if I think of our own region where you are now, you've got to understand settler colonialism, the dispossession of land, the system that led to the domination of extractive industries in our economy, has an historical and it continues in the pen. Okay, let me conclude, if I may, just with two quick points. We've just ended our 3-day conference, so I can sympathize with you, having to sit through 3 days of conference. So we had our launch, our first inaugural conference of the Southern Centre for Inequality on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday in the building next door here. there are two things I think I wanted to emphasize that emerge from it. The one is the one I've already emphasized, that I think if we're going to understand inequality, you've not only got to rethink inequality, you've got to rethink economics and the social sciences. So it's rethinking inequality means rethinking the social science project in a more holistic way. And a second point that emerged was that we have to start to identify pathways out of inequality. We need to think of, and I just want to put this one kind of policy issue. And one of the things that emerged from our papers and our research is that we're in an economy, particularly the so-called fourth industrial revolution, where increasing number of jobs are being displaced by automation. It's already happening, by the way, in our factories. If you know anything about our workplaces, you will see it. It's already happening. But and people talk about these 4 stages of, you go through steam engine, electricity, computers, and I don't buy that chronology. It doesn't fit the South. For most of the South, they're not even in the second revolution, but they have electricity. A substantial body of African people do not have electricity. Well, that's the basis of the so-called second industrial revolution. So we have to think we have to ground ourselves where we are. That is my argument. Have a look at from it. And it opens up all sorts of interesting questions. And we, for example, the idea, well, if there's no possibility of job creation, then we should think of a basic income grant. Well, yeah, that's one way of approaching it. Alternatively, we could think of how could we, and here's the challenge for this new generation economy, how could we develop a sustainable growth path in Africa that is really rooted in our particular challenges and problems. Thank you very much.
I'm not a professor, but I'll pick up from where Prof has left us. And I think for me, in my opening comrades, I want to assure you that the story of inequality is your story, is our story, and the story of inequality is my story. So let me paint you a picture. As young Africans, we increasingly find ourselves carrying multiple identities. So let me use my life. I'm young. I was younger a couple of years ago, so I actually fit within the demographic of what the UN and my government call youth. Now I'm just young. But according to our governments and our political leaders, they are young even when they are 60 and 70, and they run on the youth card. So I'm young. That's one of the identities I carry. And because I'm young, there are certain spaces that I still cannot access, culturally, economically, even in organizations. When they start to ask about certain years of experience, then I don't qualify because I'm young. Not younger as I was, but young still comparatively. I'm black. And maybe the advantage that I have is that my country got independence almost 60 years ago. It isn't the same case for most people living in this room because apartheid was just 2 decades or so ago. So I'm black. And in my country, it hasn't mattered for a long time because our colonial history is a bit distant from my generation. But increasingly, when I walk into apartment buildings in Nairobi, and when I walk into commercial buildings, I find signs written in Mandarin, not in Kiswahili, not even in English, in Mandarin. I have the privilege of traversing this continent. I arrive at airports, Harare, different countries. I find signs at the airport in Mandarin. So I think there's a challenge that even as we focus on the past and build into the future, that we must stay alert, that we must be present to new forms of inequality and colonization and oppression that is starting to take place. In my country, I come from a minority tribe. So I wasn't born with social capital that comes from coming from a larger crowd.
Presentation, quite enlightening. Only one area that I need clarification, I think last presenter, when we talked about collective power, on how we can build resistance. It seems like we are still facing the same challenge of having a huge barrier or a role in terms of collective power, because collective power cannot be achieved only from a nationalistic, point of view. But, for example, in SADC or even in East Africa or West Africa, how best can we build such power, or how best can we build such social movements? Because we have factors that come into play. We have ethnic, issues, or we have got political issues or social issues and everything. For us to build that power, what I want to find out now is which are the best modes of building power and solidarity amongst people from different nations, from different backgrounds, economic background, social background, and political background. Not only from a national perspective, but from a regional, even up to a continental, because recently we're discussing such, when after elections in Zimbabwe, guys were like, how is it that you guys, you cannot just, stand up, against this government and, rise up? These are guys who are not Zimbabweans, but I told them that it is difficult because you guys, you're not standing with us, right? And it's difficult for, like, say, maybe Senegalese or Ghanaians, when they are rising up and trying to build an equal society, when other nations are just standing and commenting, academics are writing about it and making lots of money out of this crisis. So the question is, which best modes can we use so that we can build proper solidarity within the African continent? Thank you.
Again, the last speaker raised a really interesting point about the land situation, but you didn't go into depth because probably because a lot of people know about the situation. However, I'm not so familiar with the situation. I did a study, my dissertation was about Aboriginal populations in Australia, which has a similar structure. You've got mineral mining companies coming over that are corporates, like transnational corporations, who are reappropriating the land, and people are disconnected from their identities as well as access to land which they actually own. So I wondered if you could actually give more of a clearer picture of what the situation is in South Africa in regards to that. And also I wanted to thank you both for very interesting talks, because this is a really passionate and important conversation, so thank you.
Thank you guys so much for your presentations. I think specifically because neither one of you would identify as economists, that I'm really eager to hear your perspectives on this. I always make the point as a young academic to my colleagues that what we're teaching our students as economics lecturers, and them as the future policymakers and academics and civil society, in a country that has, whether it be the Gini coefficient or Palmer ratio, however we want to go about measuring inequality, such high levels of inequality. I think that there needs to be a radical restructuring of the way we teach the economists of the future about how to think about the economy. And so I think to myself that evidently economists are not thinking in the way that we need to in order to break the deadlock of inequality. So I'm always interested to hear from other disciplines, who can I read as a young lecturer to teach my economics students from a sociologist's perspective, or from a legal perspective, from a conflict management perspective. And I understand I can't give them a degree in everything, but who can I read in an attempt to be able to teach my students to hopefully potentially think differently about a problem that evidently the way that economists in this country are currently thinking about it is not going to be solved.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentations. My question is around the concept of financial inclusion. I think we've been punting it a lot, and I'm questioning whether that is really a true instrument to change the dynamics we've seen. And I'm also interested in your perspective around financial instruments for people that are in the poverty space. So I know we've done a lot of work around banking the unbanked, etc., as a means to create and formalize this economy that the informal economy. And I'd like to understand, we've been doing a lot, and I'm not sure we've done evaluations enough around what's working and what we should continue doing and what needs to change.
If I can just answer those lines of questions.
Okay, I'm going to answer the, it's wonderful Wonderful questions. And I'm going to, the first question about collective power, I mean, you mentioned collective power, but it's at the center of an alternative, I agree with you. But the most successful example of a challenge to inequality in South Africa is the successful campaign by the Treatment Action Committee that forced us, our government, to provide the largest public health intervention in HIV/AIDS. The government had to be forced to do that, but I think the question here of collective action, it was a combination of a grassroots social movement, Treatment Action Committee, with an intelligent and strategic use of the law, particularly our Constitution. I mentioned it at the beginning, we have a progressive Bill of Rights and socio-economic rights in the Constitution. So using the combination, an active citizenry, using the existing law is an example of collective action. So I think it is possible, but it involves not just collective action. You use your corp as well. You've got to think carefully about how you use your power and use it. That's on the question of extractive industries. I mean, I think one of the features of the southern economy, the Southern Africa, is the persistence of extractive industries, exporting, the way we structure our economy, and that's our colonial past. I think there is a growing sense amongst our communities that the issue that you raised about not benefiting the communities, people are beginning to say, we've had enough. If we're going to have foreign investment, it has to benefit the local community as well. Or else you won't have any investment, unless it's going to, we've seen a number of movements that have emerged in South Africa to do that. On the teaching economics, well, it's interesting. I would, if I was teaching Economics 101, and we had a sort of special option on inequality, interestingly, there is one really comprehensive book by an economist called Sampi Tablanche. Recently passed away. And in fact, our first working paper, I brought one along with me here, actually, if anyone wants it, is by Sampi Tablanche, and he argued for a wealth tax. Of course, it felt like a lead balloon, but in argument. But he's got a book called Inequality. So I would quite frankly take a few chapters from that in 101, first year. So students can think about how the economy was constructed to benefit a small group of people. So that would be. So he's an economic historian, and that's why I think history is so important. As part of you can't teach economy without giving some kind of historical perspective on financial inclusion. I mean, I emphasized one of the reasons why we need a southern approach is because of the high level of informal economy. And the whole problem about financial inclusion, and the first thing they're going to say to you, if you want a loan, is, what collateral do you have? So I think that's a fun. By the way, you mentioned that you have a problem accessing money. I think because of a single woman. We tried this one. I went to the bank just as a test and said, can I borrow some money from you? And the bank said, nobody over the age of 65. So, I mean, so, yeah, it's, okay, but that's just a joke. It's a joke. I don't consider myself to be excluded from the economy. But and I think it's quite a fun. I mean, we've got this whole microfinance. I mean, I would put question marks over that for a variety of reasons, but I'm sure you know much more about it than I do, so, yeah.
I think I should have unpacked talking about collective power, and I agree with what Prof has said, that it's a combination of strategies, research and documentation. Increasingly, as you engage with governments and the regional economic communities and even the donor agencies, they're increasingly pushing back and putting the pressure on us to do like knowledge-led advocacy. So you need to come with evidence, and it's evidence-based campaigning and advocacy, and it's part of the reason why, maybe if I link that with what you're asking about teaching economics, that it cannot just be in the lecture hall. That students and even lecturers themselves need to move out of the academic space into communities. So maybe have a unit which is community focused, or you go and you have to stay within a community for a month or 2 months, so that you get out of the absolute nature of academic research, so that the statistics are not just black and white. It's not this argument or this argument, but you can actually see people's lives for what they are and get a texture for what it looks like. So it's a combination of practical action, policy and legislative reforms, strategic impact litigation, carrying out researches, and also combining that with going to the streets sometimes, because you can also find sometimes you're dealing with power that can only respond to equal force, for lack of a better word. With regards to how we support each other coming from different countries, I think one of the things that the last 20 or so years have shown us is the capacity for conflict and trouble to become internationalized. That a problem in Zimbabwe is not a problem for Zimbabweans, because the push factor from there will bring them to South Africa.
Absolutely.
During apartheid, the push factors from here pushed a lot of South Africans into our countries. So it means your problem is my problem, and my problem is your problem, and our problems have to be shared, and they need a common approach. But in terms of how to practically do it as a young person, the African Union, for instance, now has a youth engagement strategy around the African governance architecture. And every year they actually have sub-regional consultative meetings. So they have one for SADC, they have one for ECOWAS, they have one for the Eastern region, and they have one for Middle East and North African countries. So it's to plug into some of those opportunities. Look at what young people on the continent are doing. If you have an appetite for it, social media is another way, because there your voice and your opinion and your perspectives can actually traverse borders at very minimal cost. And I think it also starts just by changing your worldview. Like, you must get out of yourself and realize that, you know, the world is not about you, life is not about you, and be able to think about what does the world look like for the next person? What can I do to make it better? And if you have an opportunity, travel. I think what beats SADC and also the East African region is, if you compare it to ECOWAS, the free movement of people is already in effect. That, you know, a Ghanaian can go to Nigeria and Senegal and come back without any issues. I think a couple of countries are starting. Rwanda has opened up its borders, so it should become easier for young Africans. You know, during your holiday, get on a bus, go to the next country, find a friend, stay with them, get to see a different perspective of life. In terms of financial inclusion, yesterday in one of the sessions I was sitting in, someone gave an example of how recently in Cape Town, people were changing tires or something in exchange for food. So it might not be ideal, but some kind of barter trade, because if you consider that the bulk of us are actually in the informal sector. So if you don't have, someone was asking, if I don't have 20 rand when I go to Pick n Pay, must it mean I sleep hungry without bread? Or are there ways that we are able to do trade-offs on skills, trade-offs on services? The challenge with that, of course, is that because it's unregulated, and again, you can open up other opportunities for abuse. And then it's limited, obviously, because you don't just want to work for work. You also want, you know, joie de vivre. You want to feel complete, and you want to feel like you're actualized. But those are some of the conversations that started to take place. Another example that was given of the informal sector and how people run is what they do. I don't know what you call them here, but the merry-go-round. Do you have a name for it? When women come together and every day or every month they contribute money. Yeah, so we call it chama. So, and then, you know,
Rotating credit.
Yeah, the rotating credit. So if the bank will not give you money because of you don't have security, you don't have a fixed address where they can come to claim for you, there are other models that are working. And I know in my country, there's one I know of, the lady who sometimes comes to clean for me, and she was saying every day someone gets 3,000 rand. That's 30,000 Kenya shillings. That means for someone in that social class, on that day you can pay school fees, you can pay your rent, you can you can do things. So and they contribute not a lot of money, but there are many of them, and they are committed and they contribute every day, and they've drawn lots. So at the end of every day, you get 3,000 rand. It might not be a lot, but depending on where you're coming from, it's money that many people don't even earn in a month, but you can get it in a day, and then you have a turn again, maybe within the month or within 5 or so weeks. So I think those are some of the when you talk about financial inclusion, it's also giving credibility to some of those alternatives that people have found of working for themselves. I am no expert at all on the financial instruments, unless maybe there's some other capacity within the room.
We'll just have a second round of questions, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have two questions. The first one I would like to pose it to Prof. Why Southern Africa evinces such high levels of inequality? And it's the point that you also made. Is it the issue of location? Is it history? Colonialism, apartheid, racial caste in the context of South Africa? But Namibia was mentioned. They gained independence later. Is it those questions or questions of the structures of these economies that would possibly explain that? My sister, towards the end of your presentation, you were making calls to government, and also making issues, a point about collective action. But what I missed there was a call to business or industry. Was it deliberate omission? Or maybe you can take up. Related to that question is what, in your view, and perhaps Prof could add as well, what would be the relationship between the state and capital to address some of the challenges that we have, including the issue of inequality? Because in the South African context, what is also said is that there is an estimated 1.4 trillion that sits with private capital that is not invested, but you have such high levels of inequality, such high levels of poverty and unemployment and all of that that continue to exist.
Can I ask you, Nicole, could you just go to slide number 4 or 5 on the presentation? So I just first of all want to defend my profession. When I say the economist, I'm an amateur economist, I do it for fun. But you're absolutely right. But the reason why economists have such a bad name is because they shut out fellow economists. They are perfectly fabulous Marxist economists, post-Keynesian economists, structural economists, feminist economists, ecological economists that no one's ever heard of. I mean, has everyone heard the name Arthur Lewis? Okay, a few people have heard his name, right? He's the only black Nobel laureate in economics. He assisted the first independent government of Ghana with its 5-year plan. He was a fantastic man. But the important thing is he wasn't a neoclassical economist. So, which brings me to another point, which is the question relating to collective power. And here I want to go against what the general feeling is. Bugger globalism and bugger workers of the world unite. The idea of workers of the world unite was written in 1848. It's now 160 years later. How many times have the workers of the world unite? Almost zero, okay? Whereas the great establishment of the welfare states that we were talking about was achieved by the nation state, okay? Now, unfortunately, it was Jacob Zuma, but you've got to give him credit. 2 years ago, Jacob Zuma made a major policy shift away from consumption towards production with the announcement of his 9-point plan. It came out of the presidency. I don't think he came up with it. But nevertheless, it's a major shift, a brilliant shift, and the idea of black-led industrialization within this country, I think that needs a suggestion. Over there, if you look on the third item, it says, when growth occurs in sectors characterized by high asset concentration, the FIRE economy, which is which is finance, insurance, real estate, okay? And I would add to that consumption. That's neoliberalism, okay? And when you have growth in those sectors, which is high capital concentration, that can contribute to economics. So my final point is this man was here yesterday, James Galbraith. He's absolutely fabulous. Needless to say, he's not a neoclassical economist, okay? And this book is actually better than Piketty's, because Piketty comes up with the idea of the global wealth tax, which sounds a little bit like Workers of the World Unite. It's not going to happen, okay? Whereas this guy goes into sectoral analysis in the countries and shows that 95% of American inequality in the 90s were generated by tech and investment. In the North, in the 2000s was generated by the military-industrial complex and finance. Okay, so what it means is that it goes to Carl's point about where you stand is what you look. If you're standing and you're looking at production and you're looking at what sectors you want to are going to employ masses of people, and that's the way I think that you can address it. Sorry for the long speech.
And can you just pass it over at the last?
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Just on that question of alternative teaching of economics, I think future studies provides a really interesting way of approaching current problems, history, the present and the future, looking at it from a number of different layers. So the sort of surface layer with empirical evidence right down to the metaphors, what is the world system and what are the systems built on those worldviews. So yeah, future studies, something like causal layer analysis, really interesting stuff. I think, okay, so I'm from WWF, so I'm going to take this opportunity to bring the question of the environment into the room. It's something that I think is quite a big omission from this festival. If we're going to rethink economics, we really have to consider how do we, for lack of a better word, mainstream environmental considerations into economic planning and thinking. We've just come out of one of the world's worst droughts the country's ever had, but we haven't discussed it at all over these 2 days. Climate change is arguably the biggest threat to humanity, and we haven't discussed it in this last 2 days at all. So my question to the panelists is, can we address issues of inequality, poverty and unemployment and climate change at the same time? Are there any trade-offs between the two? For example, if you look at something like the carbon tax, which is a climate change mitigation policy, but that would arguably lead to higher prices, which is perverse. So there it might be a conflict where you're addressing climate change, but potentially perpetuating income inequality. Thanks.
Are there any more questions?
You really ask a question.
There are a couple of questions that have been asked about, and I think one answer that we try to touch on all of them is around the role of leadership. And I agree with you that we actually are not able to run away from the nation state, because that is what we inherited. It's the most logical unit of growth and development. And if we go beyond national security and look at human security issues, it's the easiest unit of measurement, it's the easiest unit of analysis. So we cannot go away from that. However, if I give an example of the East African region and why some sort of collective action is to go across the borders, is when you see recent trends in how we're having a lot of clawbacks on democratic governance. So you have leaders who are refusing to leave office. You have leaders who are perpetuating gross human rights violations. And because they're dictators and they're the ones leading the violations of their own citizens, and then they've controlled the parliament and they've controlled the judiciary, then it becomes more and more difficult to get justice within, to have accountability within. And so in such instances, then you find you need to go to the next level. You need the East Africa community to come in. You might have to go to the international court, the African court. So I think we can look at it as two sides of the same coin. So staying within the nation state for obvious reasons, but also being able to appreciate that sometimes, because of internationalization and internal challenges, there is then a need to go beyond an extra mile. I think the call to industry was left out by mistake, but we can have further discussions, because I think there's actually a cause for them to also undertake some actions around not undertaking illicit financial flows, how they undertake their taxation, how they treat our people who work for them, how they make sure that the gains are distributed internally, how they give fair compensation for land and natural resources that they benefit from. So I think there's definitely a need to include in that slide a call to industry. Is there a relationship between state and capital? I don't think we can run away from that. And I like the idea of future studies. There's a new science that is emerging of scenario building. And I think that would be another way of looking at the economy. So looking at all the theories and then projecting forward. If we continue on this track, what are the likely scenarios, and then how do we work from there? Poverty, inequality, climate change, I think we can't run away from linking those, and I think Prof and I were just saying we left that out in the discussion because we couldn't cover everything. But it's actually important because it's climate change and the new insecurity that it is bringing around food security that is resulting in further inequalities. You're having countries coming onto the continent and undertaking land grabs because everybody now is desperate for food. Everybody is now desperate for water. Everybody is desperate for resources. So we can't get away from climate change. Earlier someone mentioned the water crisis. So climate change is definitely something to bring into the discussion because it becomes one of the root causes of emerging new areas of inequality.
Right, thank you. Let me just pick up on three questions here. Why is inequality so high in Southern Africa? I mean, I think it's kind of simple answer in some ways. I mean, 80% of the wealth of the top 1 to 5% is in white hands. I mean, it's really about settler colonialism. It's our particular history. That's why I think we need to address that. And it is quite a puzzle. You look at the inequality. It's not just South Africa, also in Namibia. It's that sort of side by side of relatively developed, what you call a dual. The role of business, I think that's, I mean, I think that it's not just a kind of add-on. I think, it is, particularly if you're taking the approach that I'm suggesting, that you have to look at power and the structure of the economy. Well, I mean, who's driving that? And it's highly concentrated. It remains highly concentrated. It doesn't really shift it much in the post-apartheid. So I think there are a lot of things, and I think it is it must be dealt. I mean, the point you made about tax evasion. I must say, our first working paper. I'll leave 2 copies of it about a wealth tax in South Africa. The question of remuneration, CEO remuneration, equality inside the enterprise. So I think that's quite a fundamental part of any strategy. Must include a way of. I mean, the difficult thing for me is how to capture capital. I mean, the problem is. I mean, capture in a sort of rather. I mean, hold it in South Africa. That's what I mean. Because I mean, the point about globalization is you've got an exit option. You've got a very easy exit option, and we've got to find a way in which it becomes in the interest of our. I mean, we did the opposite, by the way. We in the early 90s, we allowed all the big corporates to go to London. I mean, Korea, which is a really successful of industrialization, they kept their big child bars. They got the big, and now they're major players. So I think it's absolutely fundamental. Just finally on the question of, if you look, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think to miss out on the impact of inequality is quite a serious omission on our part. From a southern perspective, I'm arguing for an interdisciplinary approach. We've got some very smart scientists here looking at the climate. They're arguing that the growth, the increase in temperature since the Industrial Revolution is moving towards 2%, 2 degrees, right? In Southern Africa, in the same time, over the same time, their prediction is that at the end of the century, it'll be 4 degrees. So when you think about a southern perspective, it actually affects our climate. I mean, you can't live the other way, I don't think. You're the expert, that word. I mean, could one live if there was a 4 degrees increase in, and I think that, there are, but we're going in the opposite direction. I mean, we'll be expanding still and depend on coal, because we're this mineral energy complex, which persists. And it's quite clear that, with all the sunshine and so on, we could actually really take seriously renewable energy as an alternative. So there are options and alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you.